racial injustices. Thank you to our esteemed scholars, Sheikh Jafar and Sayyid Sulaiman, as well as our respected community member, Latifa Barnett. We are happy to have all of you here. Before we begin the program, as usual, we're just going to go over a few announcements. Firstly, we'd like to thank our sponsors. We appreciate the sponsors of this event, and it would not be possible without their generous contributions. If you would like to sponsor the next event, please reach out to me. Sorry, it says me or you. Please reach out to Nzinga, Sister Nzinga, or Sister Zwana. Second announcement, a New Leaf Educational Co-op. It's a homeschool group that has their classes and meetings here. The students of a New Leaf Educational Co-op have asked that we make an announcement. The co-op is creating a documentary about slavery and its lasting effects on our society that they plan to present for you all in the future, inshallah. They request that you assist them by filling out a survey to help them get to know you. There is a QR code at the back, Musa, that you can scan, and it will take you to, yes, right there where the two sisters are sitting, Masuma and Sakina. It will take you to a 10-question survey. If you guys could fill that out, that would be great. And then lastly, I believe the next event for Imam al-Asr Masjid is a Quds program during Ramadan, inshallah. There will be more details to come. Okay, there's also a 15th of Sha'ban program. I'm just reading my script. Inshallah, as always, we'll begin this program with recitation of the Quran. It's not too long, but inshallah, it will be an ayah that kind of frames the rest of our discussion for the rest of the time of the program. Inshallah, we'll begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O you who have faith, be maintainers as witnesses for the sake of God, of justice, and ill feelings for a people who should never lead you to be unfair. Be fair, that is nearer to God wariness, and be wary of God. God is well aware of what you do. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So, inshallah, our first speaker will be Sayyid Sulaiman. Just a quick bio on Sayyid Sulaiman. Sayyid Sulaiman Hassan was born in Medina, New York. Growing up, he attended religious classes at the Hawza Ilmiya Wali al-Asr in Medina. In 1997, after graduating from the University of Buffalo with a degree in business administration, he proceeded to the seminary at Qom, Iran, where he specialized in fiqh and history, and he returned to the United States in 2007. Since then, he has served as a religious director at the Beit al-Ilm Academy and as the president of the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary in Streamwood, Illinois. He is now the religious director of Imam al-Asr Islamic Seminary. Sayyid also holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Chicago. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد صلى على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Respected Sheikh, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are here for a very important discussion to look at the roots of prejudice and racism and bias that exist within our societies and sometimes within our subconscious, and what is an Islamic approach for us to address and to solve that illness that we find in our own time and that we find has plagued humanity in history as well. We're looking for a cure, recognizing that there are no magic bullets. Sometimes when Muslims talk about the history of Islam, they make it seem as if humanity was steeped in ignorance and in jahiliyyah before the advent of our blessed Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And that when Islam came, those warring groups, tribes, nations, they became friends and they forgot their previous prejudices, and there was a golden era that gradually was lost or was forgotten. The miracle of our Prophet is not that his period was an exception from human history, for us to say that all of his companions were of upright character or just, and that human nature was on pause, and there is a romanticized image that we are to hold. And if we are honest with ourselves about our own Islamic history, we find that during the Prophet's lifetime, between the Muhajirin and the Ansar, between the Aus and the Khazraj among the Ansar, between Quraysh, who became Muslim after the conquest of Mecca, and the Muhajirin who had become Muslim before the conquest of Mecca, between the Arabs of the towns and the urban centers and the Arabs of the desert, let alone among the different races and nations that existed at that time, there were tensions, there were prejudices, there was animosity. The miracle of our Prophet is not that human nature was changed or that human nature was put on pause, but rather that our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa alihi, he showed us the way to transcend our baser inclinations and our temptations, and to forge an affiliation and an identity that, through recognition of the oneness of God and our humility and our vulnerability before God, brings us in harmony with God's creation, our human family in spite of our differences, and with nature and with all that God has created. After the time of the Prophet, the Muslims had civil wars. Among the first four caliphs that some people honor as the rightly guided caliphs, Al-Khulafa Ar-Rashidun, only one of the four died a natural death, and three were assassinated. And the generation that saw Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi also saw multiple civil wars. We shouldn't forget or romanticize that history, but that doesn't mean that the message of the Prophet had any less potency and power and inspiration, or that the Prophet was not successful in his preaching. It just means that we need to be more humble, and we need to be more realistic in our understanding of what that message means, and how we are to derive benefit from it and to find a way forward for our own souls and our own societies. And the first thing that we learn from Islam and from the teaching and the practice of our Prophet is that there is a commonality as well as a distinction among humanity. For most of human history, people believed in bloodlines. They believed that if a prince was separated from the royal household in infancy before he ever knew he was a prince, separated at birth through some tragedy, then even if that prince grew up as a slave in some foreign land, they didn't know about genes, but they had a sense that his royal blood and his royal genealogy would show itself, and he would still become a master or a king among his own people. And his destiny would bring him maybe back to his ancestral kingdom and maybe a new kingdom. But for many people, the same way that you and I think about that and say that it's gullible, they would say that we don't understand the power of a bloodline and the reality of a royal inheritance. It was real for them, not because it actually existed, but because their certainty created a social reality. And when the Quran tells us, إِنَّ أَوْلَى النَّاسِ بِإِبْرَاهِيمَ لَلَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُ وَهَذَا النَّبِيُّ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَاللَّهُ وَلِيُّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. We have a very beautiful hadith from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. The verse of the Quran is that the most worthy people of the name of Prophet Ibrahim, the patriarch and the forefather of monotheism, are those who followed Ibrahim, not those who take pride that we are the descendants of Ibrahim. وَهَذَا النَّبِيُّ, and this prophet that the people of the book looked down on scornfully, that he is from the unlettered Arab community, not from us who have a noble heritage of prophecy and sacred books and live in the Holy Land and whatever other forms of pride they have. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, and those who believe in God and in His Prophet. In explaining this verse, our sixth Imam said to his Shia and to his followers and companions, those who were willing to court the oppression of the governments of their time and to suffer in society and in their economic life and in their political life because they said that we will follow the Islam of Ahlul Bayt. We will follow not the Islam of power, but the Islam of piety and purity. The Imam says, Antum min ali Muhammad. Antum wallahi min ali Muhammad. And the narrator says, Ju'iltu fidak min anfusihim. The Imam said to his Shia, that you are among the family of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And the narrator says, this is the Imam who is ma'soom and who is a direct descendant of the Prophet and Sayyidah Fatima and Amir al-Mu'mineen speaking. How can I, of normal birth or maybe of lowly birth, be in any way equal or share in the lineage of the Imam? So he says, from themselves. And then the Imam says 3 times, Na'am min anfusihim, min anfusihim, min anfusihim. Yes, you are from the family of the Prophet themselves. And the Imam emphasized it 3 times. Because people had an idea of a lineage giving a shortcut to having your prayers answered or getting a VIP seat in paradise, it was even for the Shia, and these were not people who were given this honor by the Imam who were unfamiliar with the Sunnah and the Seerah of the Prophet. These were not people who had just become Muslim yesterday and didn't have a familiarity with the Quran. Many of them were huffaz of the Quran and daily reciters of the Quran. They were intimately familiar with and hence studied the life of the Prophet and the teachings of the Prophet, and yet just because of how real it was in society for there to be a sacred lineage, they couldn't wrap their heads around it. Inna awla an-nasi bi Ibrahim. And in a hadith of our first Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam, he says that this applies to all of the prophets. The Quran uses Ibrahim because there was a contention over affiliation to Ibrahim alayhi wa ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wassalam, that the Jews said that we are his heirs and followers, and the Christians said that we are his heirs and his followers. And the Quran said that it is those whose character, whose values, whose lives are in line with Ibrahim alayhi salam that are more worthy of that affiliation and that name. But the principle is not exclusive to Prophet Ibrahim. It applies to all prophets. And it applies to our prophet. It is not a bloodline that makes me better than you, but rather it is my actions, it is my character that makes me worthy of honor in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regardless of my background. And in another hadith, it is narrated that our 6th Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, he says that wilayati li amir al-mu'mineen ahabbu ilayya min wiladati min. My being a wali of Amir al-Mu'mineen, a lover and a follower of Amir al-Mu'mineen, being on the path of Amir al-Mu'mineen, which means to be on the path of the Prophet, to be on the path of following the truth and following what is just. That is more beloved to me than the fact that I min wiladati min, that I was born of the lineage of Amir al-Mu'mineen. If I had to choose one or the other, then I would value and I would choose a wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen that is sincere and true over the worldly honor of being born from the lineage of Amir al-Mu'mineen. So contrast, today we don't have to spend a lot of time saying that a pauper raised as a prince will think that he is a prince. And a prince raised as a pauper will probably growing up thinking that he is a pauper. In fact, if you go back far enough in most of your family trees, you probably are the descendant of some king or queen somewhere and some slave somewhere or other. It's just what parts of our narratives and our stories have been preserved and which parts have been forgotten. But the fact that within just a few generations or a few centuries, common sense and received wisdom can change so fundamentally, 180 degrees, it gives us an idea of how powerful these social constructs are. Today, for many people in the West, race is a reality. But it does not exist in this form in many other societies today or in history. But even in those societies that don't recognize race as a category, because it's not indigenous to their culture and their living, they will have their own forms of bias. Sometimes it will be colorism. In my own community, you have two children born from the same father and the same mother, exact same race, and exact same genealogy. One of them has a lighter complexion, one of them has a darker complexion. One of them is going to be honored. They're lucky. They're going to find a good spouse. The other one will be told, don't go out in the sun too much because you'll get even darker. Who's going to marry you? Now, there is no concept of race, but there is a prejudice over complexion, or there is a prejudice over caste, or there is a prejudice over anything. No human society and no human being is free from that temptation of shaitan to otherize, to condescend, to feel superior, or to be made to feel inferior. But one thing that we learn from Islam is that, number one, we don't have to adjudicate whose oppression is greater or whose narrative is truer, or which social construct has a better or a worse basis in biology or in genealogy or in any other factor. These are discussions that people spend a lot of time on to either prove or disprove emotional or physical or intellectual differences or similarities among whatever group of human beings they may wish to identify with. It's not that you might not get tentative or even definitive answers, but that it is a waste of time. Because the Quran says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. There is a reason why you have been created into groups, organic groups of nations and tribes and communities, and that is simply so that you have something to recognize yourselves by. It is for mutual recognition and no other purpose. And therefore, the foundation of our identity and the foundation of our motivations in life is not to bring honor to my nation, or to bring honor to my family, or to bring honor to my race, or to bring honor to my tribe against another. But rather, inna akramakum indallah atqakum. To strengthen my relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then to have no relationship with anyone except for the sake of and through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then if there is a social group that I have been placed in by Allah, then I recognize it's not a coincidence. No one was born in the wrong ethnicity or in the wrong time, place, family, gender, because none of it was a coincidence. It was a choice by Allah in His infinite wisdom that He placed me in this environment and in this circumstance. And so if Allah has made me a member of an oppressed community, then Allah has given me a test and an opportunity to uplift my community, but not to get revenge, not to show them, not in opposition to anyone else, but in order to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if Allah has placed me in a privileged community, then that also is a test and an opportunity to use what I have been given for the upliftment, to show a candle to those people who may be arrogant about the gifts and privileges they have been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to build bridges with those who may have been downtrodden. One of the less spoken about but beautiful examples we have from the life of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, is that although they were at the pinnacle of Arabian society, honored in Jahiliyyah, and that is why Banu Umayyah, they were jealous of Banu Hashim, not because of Islam and not because of Prophet Muhammad. They were envious of them in Jahiliyyah because of the honor that this family had before Islam. From the time of Hashim and Abdul Muttalib and Abu Talib, alayhimus salam. And then they only increased in their honor and in their dignity and also in their wealth in Islam. Imam Ali was one of the wealthiest people of his time. Don't let it fool you that he gave away all of his wealth and he lived the simplest life. But in terms of his wealth and in terms of his income, he was one of the wealthiest people in Arabia. Abdullah ibn Ja'far and other members of Banu Hashim, they also were at the pinnacle of society. But one of the told stories of Islam is that Banu Hashim always, and when I say Banu Hashim, I mean our Imams and the heirs of the Prophet, they always prioritized their relationship with those who were at the very bottom of society. Sometimes in the early days of Islam, there was a dispute among the Muhajirin and the Ansar. The story of Saqifa, however you may see it in religious and theological terms, it was a return to that tribal mentality. The Ansar gathered, there's Muhajirin. They're in our city, but they are our guests. What should we do? And the Muhajirin said, this is our religion and our heritage. And the Ansar are going to try to grab it. What should we do? And so there was that pull and push. Sometimes they would compose poetry against one another. And in one of those incidents, and usually it was the Muhajirin who started things, during the time of the Prophet and afterwards, it is usually the aristocracy that provokes the fight. But then how those who are oppressed respond determine how the story will end. Because that is not in the hands of those with material power. They are often the poorest. At one time, a number of poets from the Muhajirin, they insulted the Ansar. And the Ansar were waiting now for one of their poets to come and respond. And Amir al-Mu'mineen, he said that no, you will not respond. And he told a poet from the family of Hashim, according to some reports it was Al-Fadl ibn al-Abbas, that you go and you respond on behalf of the Ansar to the charges, to the insults levied by the representative of the Muhajirin. Now, a team member of the Muhajirin, a member of that tribe, and not just a member, the most honorable and the most dignified of them, says that we will stand with the Ansar. They have been wronged, and this is not a time to whitewash or to ignore. This is a time to admit and to stand with the oppressed. And that did several things. First of all, it took the wind out of the sails of the Muhajireen's arrogance, because their pride was through the Prophet and what the Prophet had brought for humanity. And the family of the Prophet is saying that they were out of line. And it also obviated the need for the Ansar to defend themselves. And although the prejudice may have remained on both sides, the ignorance may have remained within society, rather than becoming an antagonistic relationship, there was a softer and a better landing for the Muslim Ummah, such that many of us may have read about Islamic history, but we have skipped that page of it. But we need those people in our society from different communities who can understand the language and even the ignorance and the prejudices of other groups and can serve as bridges. And the greater burden, of course, is on those who have greater knowledge, who have greater privilege within society, to make sure that they are clear on what is right and what is wrong, what is fair and what is unfair. And like Ahlul Bayt themselves did in their time, they stand with those who are being wronged and make space for them and honor them in their own company. And we don't have time to go through the examples, but when we speak of the generosity of Imam Hussein and Imam Hassan and our later Imams, remember that it wasn't just generosity. Sometimes we mention stories from history and we explain them in the context of generosity. But when Imam Hassan is invited by slaves, and Imam Hassan doesn't hesitate to say yes, imagine what it must have been like for an aristocrat by birth. Of course, Imam Hassan alayhi salam was not an aristocrat by character or by practice, but somebody at the pinnacle of society is invited by people whose clothes are dirty and probably in tatters, whose fingernails are probably filled with the grime of manual labor, who have calluses and injuries on their body. The kind of people that when I or you see them in the street, we look away. When we sit next to them on public transportation, if we take public transportation, we kind of collect ourselves. And Imam Hassan said that, yes, I will join you. And he didn't have any hesitation. And then, what did Imam Hassan do? He invited them to his own home. And he said, if you shared with me whatever you had, then it is my duty to share with you whatever I had. That's not just the generosity of Imam Hassan. That is a continuation of the seerah of the Prophet and the seerah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, to say that we are to make sure that although there are those differences in privilege and in position within society, it is our duty to build bridges and to undo the ignorance that exists. The last example that I will give out of many that we have from Ahlul Bayt is from our seventh Imam, Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam. Now by this time, Islam had spread and the imperial culture of Rome and Persia had also entered into the Muslims' lives, and people objected to our Imams working with their hands. Imam Baqir and Imam Sadiq and Imam Qasim, they used to work with their own hands, and people couldn't understand it. They would say that you're wealthy enough to retire. You're wealthy enough to hire somebody to do this work for you. You can outsource it. And the Imam said, yes, I can. But those who were greater than me worked with their own hands. My Prophet, Amir al-Mu'mineen, they did this work with their own hands. It builds character and humility. It's not because I need to do it and I can't pay somebody to do it, but rather because it is worthy for a person to work and not just to command. One of the things that people objected to Imam Kazim for is that when he would go out to his lands and his fields, there would be people who would be working for him. Slaves, former slaves, hired workers. Many of them, they didn't speak Arabic because they had been from foreign societies. Many of them may have been illiterate, manual laborers. But the Imam would pause and he would speak with them. And he would say to them, what is it that you think we could do differently or we could do better? If you were speaking to a gardener, how can we manage this place better? Not that this is the manual labor. What do they know about managing an important agricultural enterprise or industrial enterprise? They have a vantage point. And even if what they say is not going to be new to you, then that very interaction will bring God's blessing. So people, they saw Imam Kazim when he would go out into his gardens, his orchards. He would speak to those very basic workers with a great deal of importance and attention. And they would say that you are who you are. We come to you for your insight, for your knowledge. We know that you are a ma'soom imam. You don't need to ask philosophers and the best physicians and the most knowledgeable people of society about anything because you have knowledge given to you by Allah. And you are asking this former slave here in this orchard how to take better care of your affairs. And the Imam says this is for barakah. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He can cause wisdom to flow from the tongue of any of His servants, the most mighty or the most humble. That is the lesson that we learn from Ahlul Bayt. Don't deny the differences that exist. Don't wish away the ignorance or the prejudices that exist within society. They are here to stay. Until such time as we truly internalize the message of Islam, that all of these differences, they are there for us to be able to tell each other apart and to recognize and to develop a relationship. They are the color and the flavor of our society and our mutual interactions. We don't need to adjudicate and discuss some of those trivial matters that take up our attention, but rather we need to see what is the place that God has placed me in. What are the talents and the opportunities that He has given me? What are the tests that He has given me? And what can I do? Because I believe in one God, who is the source and origin of all that exists, to bring together those who may not otherwise ever come together, and to honor the practice and the teaching and the ideals given to us by Muhammad wa ali Muhammad alayhimus salatu wassalam. We have the greatest inspiration in the practice of Ahlul Bayt. We have the greatest inspiration in the teachings of our Prophet. We have the greatest inspiration in the text of our scripture, the Quran. And now the challenge is for us not to beat around the bush, not to ignore that we have to understand the realities of our history and our society, and we have to actively work to undo the layers of prejudice, some visible and some invisible. The responsibility lies on each and every one of us. And it is not a quick task, but it is a blessed task, because it was the task of those who were chosen by Allah and those who were the most noble and the most pious. And one of the things, and the final point that I will make, that helps us is to remember that we, especially in this month of Sha'ban, we are remembering and we are honoring the one who has been chosen by Allah as the savior of humanity. If I don't come to terms with injustice and recognize injustice, then with what honor, with what sincerity can I ever say to Allah that I prayed for the hastening of the one who will end injustice? If I don't recognize the prejudice, if I don't recognize the ignorance that I may have within me, then I can superficially say that I am awaiting God's promised Savior, but it will not have substance. So one of the things that helps us is to deepen our connection with the Imam of our time in terms of the purpose of his message, and then to see how far our lives and our priorities and our own societies are from those ideals. That will bring humility, but it will also bring hope. Because in the end, those of us who stand on the path of Ahlul Bayt, they are promised by Allah that وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, the end result and the outcome will be in your favor. So we don't need to get impatient. We don't need to lose hope. We don't need to get frustrated and write a big rant and then post it publicly because to hell with everything, nobody understands. You're already going to win. The key is, what am I doing to make sure that I am worthy of the role models that I hope and pray and claim to follow? And inshallah, through events like this, through the insights that we will hear from Shaykh Ja'far, a person who has long experience on this topic, and subsequent events, we will be able to take steps on that path of understanding and breaking down barriers and building bridges so that we can create a model community according to the teachings of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Thank you so much, Sayyid Sulaiman, for that wonderful speech on spiritual remedies. I just want to say a quick word before we go on to the next speaker. This program is called Navigating Racial Injustices. And as far as when you analyze and look back at all the historical racial injustices that have happened, one of the common themes that you see is there's a constant dehumanization of the party that is being persecuted. And there are two aspects to that dehumanization. One is a society-wide push to tell that story. And then the other is a discouragement from learning about the other people as well. And so as Sayyid Sulaiman mentioned, when the Quran says, we created you in nations and tribes so that you know each other, you get to know one another, لِتَعَارَفُوا. That word, that knowing of one another is necessary in finding the humanity between the nations and tribes. Okay, it's necessary in finding the humanity between the nations and tribes, and once we bond in that humanity, then my concerns are your concerns, and your concerns are my concerns. And inshallah, we bind together in that humanity to serve Allah to the best of our ability. Now, I'd like to welcome the next speaker, Sister Latifa Barnett. Latifa Barnett, just a quick introduction, has always been inspired toward two endeavors: pursuing reliable Islamic guidance and empowering families to nurture their human potential through lifelong learning, spiritual development, and personal growth. In an effort to promote her love of teaching and learning, Latifa has organized and engaged with several community organizations over the last 2 decades. She has been a dedicated supporter of multiple religious and educational efforts for the benefits of families in the Shia Muslim community, including most recently Imam al-Asr Youth Circle. She earned her master's in education and mathematics, and her professional teaching career has spanned 30 years. During this time, she has worked in both public and private schools and colleges. She is a passionate proponent of home education, and she has spent the last 18 years teaching her 6 children, me being one of them. In addition to her own children, Latifa has supported more than 10 families through their homeschool journeys, with 5 of those students currently thriving in college. Please welcome her up with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
I can't get this on. This is discrimination against hijab. Okay, I'm nervous. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah. That's my mama. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, master of the day of judgment, he who gives me every breath, he who inspires my every step. Let him guide my tongue. Bismillah. Thank you for having me. It's a hard act to follow, coming behind Sayyid Sulaiman. He always has so much to share. And so I'm going to try my best to do you guys the justice and make a point. This is a hard conversation to have, and so I wanted to clarify some things before we get into the nitty-gritty. So I'm going to start talking about systems, because in order to really understand how racism plays out and where racism hides, we have to understand systems, right? In particular, social systems. A social system is a patterned network of relationships constituting a coherent whole that exists between individuals, groups, and institutions, right? So there are all of these things acting together with one another for specific outcomes. And in general, systems, what do systems do? In general, systems are designed to enable adherence to a set of well-specified goals. In this case, we're going to discuss the system of racism, right? But this discussion can easily be applied to any system: sexism, ableism, capitalism, any system that is been created, any human social system that has been created and does not have as an objective seeking to adhere to divine laws. So any system that has been, see, I told you it was a screen. Any system that has been established to forward some sort of aim, and that aim does not adhere to seeking of the divine laws, will fall under this parameter. Systems are made to perpetuate themselves. So, in racism, I want to make this distinction before we go further, because people get very, very sensitive when we talk about racism. And the first thing we always often utter is, I'm not racist, that's not me. And the reason why that happened is because most people associate racism with discrimination, right? Where discrimination is a behavior or a manifestation of prejudice and usually involves some kind of negative action or malicious intent, right? Most people think of racism as an overt, malicious, or negative act that is driven by a belief that one race is inferior and one race or other races are superior. Hence, we bring it up. Everyone says, this doesn't apply to me. I would never do that. I'd never intentionally act against a person because of their race. And I think we all agree, most of us agree, that it's not a good thing to do. Most people think it is unacceptable to mistreat people based on their race. So discrimination is not what we're talking about today. No one is talking about being a discriminatory, violent actor. On the other hand, racism, the American Psychological Association defines racism as a form of prejudice that assumes that members of racial categories have a distinctive characteristic and that these differences result in some racial groups being inferior to others. Racism generally includes negative emotional reactions to members of that group and the acceptance of negative stereotypes and discrimination against those individuals, and sometimes leads to violence, okay? Racism is a form of prejudice that assumes. It's not a form of action necessarily, but prejudice. And racism can look like many things, right? But it usually starts with negative emotional reactions and acceptance of prejudice, then to discrimination, and then to violence. It's a spectrum, right? So the important thing is, and I'm proud of this next one because I made it myself. The important thing is that when you put all of this together in the system of racism, right, you have mental stuff that is influencing other things, right? So my claim is that we live in a system of racism that influences our assumptions, values, and beliefs in such a way that it predisposes us to preferential treatment of people in a racial hierarchy. That's my claim. I don't have the time to prove it right now because it's a really long philosophical discussion, but I'm claiming that, and I'm going to ask you to hypothetically go with me and pretend like it's proven, okay? Instead of talking about proving how this is true or why this is true, I'm going to try to illustrate it by examining the impacts of this influence using our lived experiences and some other statistical data, all right? So now I'm going to ask you to go with me on this journey, right? Metacognition is thinking about one's own thinking, right? And so as we're on this journey, I want you to right now take an opportunity to think about your own thinking. So on the next few slides, I'm going to show you some images and some words. And when you see them, I want you to notice your own initial reactions to them. What do you think of? What do you see? What do you see is going to be the question on all of the slides. And as you think of your first reaction and you reflect upon it, ask yourself why you think that or why you feel that. We're not going to share. We're just going to go on this journey together. All right. Ready? Bismillah. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? Now, what do you see? 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 Yeah, some of you got that joke, huh? The perceptions, assumptions, and biases we have about Black people and images play out in our minds, but also play out in very destructive ways. The impact of subtle biases and perceptions make big differences in people's lives. So let's see. I'm going to examine how one's primal reactions to different people based on the influences of the society really changed the experiences of Black and brown people in this country. What follows is a bunch of quotes. This is just statistics, right? The myth of Black on Black crime. I know back in 2020, when our country went through some upheaval surrounding the George Floyd murder, the Black Lives Matter movement became very popular. And oftentimes in circles you hear when people say Black Lives Matter, the response is, if Black lives matter so much, why is there so much black on black crime? And black on black crime is touted as this big problem that where black people just systematically destroy each other, you know. But if you look at the statistics, 57% of violent crime against white people are perpetrated by white people. And 63% of violent crimes against black people are perpetrated against black people. So it makes you wonder, those numbers are not statistically far off. Why is there so much talk about black on black crime? Employment. A meta-analysis of field experiments conducted from 1990 to 2015 showed that on average, white applicants received 36% more callback than black applicants with identical resumes, and the hiring rates had not changed over time. So those little impressions and perceptions and assumptions and beliefs that people have are impacting the lives of people. Researchers surmise that insufficient oversight of hiring process, as well as little change in racial stereotypes and unconscious bias may be responsible. That unconscious bias may be responsible for 36% more callbacks. Okay. I'm not going to give a lot about law enforcement and incarceration because I think this is probably the most well-known impact of racism in our country. But I do want to say this. These laws and these perceptions make it so that black people have to be careful walking down the street. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to act any way. They just have to be present. The New York Police Department stop and frisk policy endangers the life of black people because all they have to do is be standing on the street. And if they're not even probable cause, if they are thought, if they're suspected, if they are in the wrong place at the wrong time, they could be at risk based on someone's perceptions, beliefs, assumptions. Medical treatment. In 2016, a team of researchers studied a group of medical trainees. They found that 40% of first and second year medical students, these are the best of the best. You know, they got into med school. These aren't students who are at the bottom of their class. This is the best of the best. 40% of them believe that black people are not as sensitive to pain as white people. And we're less likely to treat black people's pain appropriately. Of those 40%, those false beliefs actually impacted the way they diagnosed and treated people. But even the extant research shows, even those people who do not propose to believe that black people have different pain receptors than white people, even those people prescribe less medicine to black people. So something's going on. It's not just, this is the statistics. It's not just people's conscious beliefs. People's unconscious beliefs are also guiding their decision making. Oh, there's so much to say about home ownership and mortgages. But let's just put it this way. Historically, in the 1930s, the government conspired to make sure that black people stayed contained in certain areas and did not have access to mortgages and home ownership opportunities in other areas. And the impact of what happened 80 years ago is still being felt today in Black communities by Black people seeking home ownership. More. In the study of home mortgages in 2016, researchers found racial discrimination still exists in mortgage lending. African Americans are twice as likely to be denied a mortgage when controlling for income. And they say that, there are other reasons like credit score and debt to income ratio, but even when those things are analyzed and factored for, the numbers still look the same. The denial rates are still the same. I pulled this particular statistics about preschoolers because they're preschoolers. And I just wanted to show how pervasive this can be. In a study of preschool suspensions, researchers found Black children being about 3 times as likely to be suspended from preschool than their white counterparts. What are preschoolers? They're 3 years old. If we don't get conscious of these things, we're seriously damaging very, very young children. So now I'm going to take a look at what happens in our community. And I'm going to give 2 examples. While attending an Eid celebration, 2 non-Desi community members were told they were in the wrong place. The Adams Center Eid celebration is down the road. Within our community, Black children are often asked to recite Surah Al-Fatiha or the Shahadatain to prove that they're real Muslims. Or asked, what are you doing here? Why are you here? As if there should be other reason for being at the masjid. There are many more incidents, but it's not my purpose to harp on this. It's not my purpose to make anyone feel guilty. It's not my purpose to even know where you stand on this. The purpose of all of this is to build a background. Information to answer the big question. Where do you think racism lies? Where do you think it hides? Anybody? Someone says here. Anybody else? Our ignorance. Subconscious. Anybody else? Here. Here and here. Our head and our hearts. That's where it hides. And it hides because we prefer to ignore it. So how can we find solutions? When I have conversations with people about race, usually towards the end of the conversation, I hear something like, yeah, my aunt could really talk to you. She should really talk to you because, she says all kinds of things and she could really learn about racism. Or, you know what? You told me about this book. I'm going to give it to my cousin. She could really learn a lot from it. And we think of all the people who could really, really benefit from the information. But really, each and every one of us has to look inside. We have to look inside ourselves because racism is a spiritual disease. And it's being forced upon us subconsciously. We take it in without even thinking about it. We breathe it in, we walk it. And it's a revolutionary step to take the time to think about it, to reflect upon it, to root it out, to pull it from you, and to rebel against this system that has implanted these thoughts in you since you were born, before you were born, right? So how do we do that? Alhamdulillah, we have tools in our faith. Right? Oh, you who believe, be maintainers of justice and witnesses for the sake of Allah, even if it should be against yourselves or your parents and near relatives. And whether someone be rich or poor, for Allah has a greater right over them. So, what tools can we use? If we actually do believe racism is influencing us, then this verse makes it apparent that we must make an effort to fight against it. We must. It is our duty to do it. And we can use familiar practices that Allah has already given us, that our Ahlul Bayt has shown us, to help us develop spiritually and root out this disease. Right? That first practice is, of course, to ask Allah for help. When we feel at a loss about something, what to do, where to go, when we have doubts about what has been put before us, and we have choices to make, but we don't know what to do, we should always turn to Allah and beg Him for help. Iyyaka nasta'in. We ask Him for help in confronting the forces in this world, both forces inside and outside of ourselves, to be able to recognize and challenge these destructive systems with His help. So the first, always start with Allah and ask Him for help. Second is to plead and pray and beg Allah for the return of the Mahdi alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Because He's the one who will restore justice. And we beg Allah for His return. And thirdly, and this is the part that is probably the hardest, is we have to be vigilant, vigilant and reflective, introspect. We have to find those places where we look at those images and we see those words and we negatively associate blackness. We have to root those things out of ourselves and our souls. We have to make an intention every day to do so. We have to make an intention to do so for the pleasure of Allah. And we have to monitor our thoughts and actions. And we have to then evaluate whether or not we are doing a good job at it. So the practices of muraqabah, muhasabah, that are already a part of our faith, we just add these intentions into them. And finally, what we can do personally, our actions. We can end denial. Denial that racism exists is one of the biggest obstacles to ending racist injustice in this country. It is a big problem because all of the system acts to deny its existence. Because people feel better not addressing the system that has caused so much pain and hurt and oppression in this world. When it comes to racism, we have been derelict in our duty in standing for justice. We should aim to create a community in which it is impossible to deny racism. And the only way to do that is to talk about it. And it's hard. It's hard for me. Second thing we need to do is educate ourselves. Dedicate ourselves to figuring out whether or not the system of racism is influencing us. We should explore our thoughts, beliefs, perceptions to see what comes up, and examine how our actions are affected by them. We should read about the history of white supremacy, how it was established before and after the establishment of this country. We should speak out, and I should say speak with as well. We need to have conversations. We need to know one another. We need to get to know one another for real. We need to invite each other to each other's houses. We need to actually speak to each other when we see each other in community. One of the reasons why racism is so pervasive is because it's invisible to people who are not negatively feeling its effects. Our silence allows it to remain invisible, and we can use our voices to make it visible. And finally, to take action. In our family, friend groups, work life, Islamic institutions, we should help establish policies that resist racist ideas and practices. That means that we have to be aware of those impacts, and we have to create systems within our institutions and families and hearts and homes that resist it. And we truly, truly, truly want to live in the path of our imams. We have to do this. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you for listening, and inshallah we can take guidance from Allah and our Ahlul Bayt and establish this justice. Salawat.
صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Thank you so much, Sister Latifa, for that presentation. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of time, so I would like to recap some of the announcements that I made before everyone was in here. So, inshallah, the students of a New Leaf Educational Co-op, they're a co-op that meets here to hold some of their classes and activities. They have asked that I make an announcement. They are creating a documentary about slavery and its lasting effects on our society, and they plan to present it for you all in the future, inshallah. They request that you assist them by filling out a survey to help them get to know you all. There's a QR code that you can scan at the back of the room. Yes, at the back table, you can scan the QR code. What is that? I'm not sure what that is. Anyways, yeah, so that would be greatly appreciated. Additionally, just to give you guys an understanding of who put on this program, Stand for Justice DMV is a coalition of Muslims based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. They are committed to establishing an ongoing platform to teach and learn about living and practicing Islam in a world that often challenges Islamic values and beliefs, consciously working toward a rich, diverse, and united community that includes, uplifts, and appreciates Muslims from a variety of races, cultures, and ethnicities. And lastly, collaborating with like-minded individuals and organizations to end widespread racial injustice, as well as anti-Black attitudes and behaviors unique to our Muslim community. Now, lastly, before we introduce our last speaker, you're gonna have to hear me ramble a little bit more. I just wanted to follow up on Sister Latifa's presentation about, and kind of go back to what I said before and what Sayyid Sulaiman said as well, about the importance of knowing and getting to know one another. This past semester, I've done a little bit of study on the, basically, philosophies about race and is race real, the metaphysics of race, all that kind of stuff. But one of the interesting discussions that we had over the course of that class was about racial identities and whether it's permissible, morally permissible to hold them. One of the interesting opinions that I ran across was one that said that your identity, your racial identity, is basically what people first think when they look at you, a combination of two things. It's what people first think when they look at you, what comes to their mind immediately, and then it's also their experiences and interactions with you that kind of shape that identity. And so if you take that and apply ta'arufu, or getting to know one another, to that, then that allows for an expansion of that understanding. So let's say if when I see a specific type of person, I have a negative thought about them, but then I interact with that person and I have a positive experience, now my perception is forever changed. And that's how we get closer to that bonding in humanity that Sayyid Sulaiman mentioned, and I repeated basically. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sheikh Jafar Muhibbullah. Sheikh Jafar has spent over 20 years studying Islam in America and abroad. He writes and speaks on a wide variety of relevant and important topics representing the Muslim voice. Sheikh Jafar holds a MA in Islamic Studies from Duke University. He participated in advanced studies in Islamic jurisprudence and completed research towards a PhD. His studies include Arabic, Persian, and Urdu literature, discourse analysis, Islamic philosophy, law, and theology. He is currently resident scholar of Islamic Ahlul Bayt Association in Austin, Texas, and also serves as a board member of the Interfaith Action of Central Texas. Inshallah, let's welcome him up with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So I'm going to start with the verse that also Sister Latifa, she ended with, which is also a major part of what I want to discuss as well. And I'm not going to give a lecture, but I will give a presentation. But as part of that presentation, at least the name of it is how to, or at least the Muslim American Guide to navigating racial injustice. And very specific about Muslim American, because our identity as Muslims is more important than anything else. Especially as Sayyid Sulaiman, he mentioned, he was pointing out, yes, we are put into our ethnic categories, or we are, put in whatever situation we are in by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the most important thing should be our identity as Muslims. And so how do we navigate this, especially in our current situation and location? So my presentation is also a bit autobiographical. So part of it, you're going to learn a little bit more about me, and also just about this idea of navigating racial injustice kind of in America itself. And what I want to do, I'm going to have a presentation, a video. And initially, I want you just to watch the video. It's very short, 1 minute, 50 seconds. But in that, what we want to point out is that how to navigate this racial injustice is that we need 4 things. I'm going to point these 4 things out, and then I'll start the video. So first of all, having a calling. If we are present in our masjid, in our centers, that's part of our calling. Second is our prayer. Third is having, or at least understanding, the purpose of life, the meaning of life. And third is regarding our identity. That's who are we as an individual and as a community. So I'm going to start this, and it's mostly some images, but, and it has some dates, and I'm going to explain that when I go back over. In the beginning, there's a bit of a sound, so you can. I don't know, is it?
Nature with your reprobate mind, animal loving, underhanded, backstabbing, double dealing, double crossing devils. I know now you brought VE, AIDS, syphilis, gonorrhea to the ends of the earth. And after all of this, far concept of my people calling you.
Okay, so we'll stop that.
Nature with your reprobate mind, animal loving, underhanded, backstabbing.
So sorry about that. I don't know how to make this silent. Is it? Okay. So, is it? Yeah, just the sound. Yeah, just the sound. Okay. So also we want to make this a little bit interactive. I'll go ahead and start my presentation. So how do we navigate in practical sense? So of course we have the best of guidance from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afdalus salatu wassalam, and they've told us, as Sayyid Sulaiman, he has presented. Okay. Oh, you put this. Okay. So that should play. Okay, good. It's good. It's going to play without. So, how do we navigate this? And what is also autobiographical about this particular presentation is when we speak about racial injustice, this is something I think a lot of the individuals who are, as even Sayyid Suleiman, he stated, that are colored. They're not Caucasian, they are maybe brown skin, could be black, could be Latino, could be Asian as well, because there was actually a point that, you know, Middle Easterners, they were allowed to actually migrate to America, you know, those who were from Lebanon or from Syria, but when those who were actually from the subcontinent tried to enter, they were denied citizenship. I said, no, you can't. Why? Because of the color of their skin. But around, I believe it's 1920, when that kind of, or a little bit after 1920, that changed a bit. So sometimes those who are living in that situation, it's something that's on their mind. That, you know, what's going on here? Why are we facing these things? Myself, particularly as well, something that was always on my mind, roughly in 1987, this is when I kind of started my journey, and I discovered Islam through reading my own history as my background, part from African descent and part from Native American descent. And so in both of these backgrounds, one of the things that I came across and I discovered was Islam. It was very much a part of both of my heritage, meaning that, and this is something sometimes we don't think about, but even prior to the Europeans coming to America, America had a rich history of Islam. There was an engagement with the Muslims. And we'll leave more detail for a little bit later. So 1987 was my journey. It began, I don't know.
Just click on it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so Professor Griffin, last year's Asiatic Disciples, and you probably guys are like, what is this guy? Shahe is playing music in the masjid? Actually, if you listen carefully, they were playing the adhan. This is actually the very first place I ever heard the adhan, before I even heard it in the masjid. And when I became Muslim, I embraced Islam. When I went into the masjid and I heard Allahu Akbar, I was like, oh, what? Professor Griff? I said, whoa, this is... But why is that? And what was the point? So we all have to have our calling. Part of the calling, for some individuals, was this kind of creative measures that they took in order to, again, connect with their identity, connect with something that was a part of their past. And so they took that and they put it into the likes of Professor Griff, Eric B. and Rakim, and also those particular, you could say rap, because if we look into the history of rap as well, Muslims were very much a part of the foundation of rap. And it was a way to communicate Islamic thought, certain aspects of Islam. But this system here, and Latifah, she talked about systems, they specifically targeted rap and changed it into what it is today. And most of those messages about Islam at that point began to get erased from the rap music. 1926, which is associated with this gentleman here, who is Noble Drew Ali. He founded this organization, which is the Moorish Science Temple, which according to the history kind of got muddled at one point. But Moorish Science Temple, if you look at the foundation, and again, this is something that I believe when we look at, how the Moorish Science Temple was put under scrutiny, how things were kind of changed, again, very intentional. But a lot of times we're not thinking about this. So what Noble Drew Ali was stating, he was like, look, all of those individuals who are of African descent, he says, look, our roots go back to West Africa for the most part. And what was West Africa? What was West Africa in the 15th, 16th century when the slave trade kind of began, 13th century? It was a Muslim land. Since the 10th century, the whole of West Africa, or a great chunk of West Africa, was Muslim land. And so where did a great deal of those Muslims come from, or the slaves come from? It came from Muslim lands. So Noble Drew Ali, he was like, look, no, you don't say that we're this or that. We are Moorish, meaning that we are connected to the Moorish identity. And what does Moorish mean? If we translate that into Arabic, it means al-Maghrib. So they were part of the Western Muslim Empire. And so this is what Noble Drew Ali said. And also, another very interesting thing about Noble Drew Ali, so he stated when he established the Moorish Science Temple, he says, I am coming to teach my people Islam as it was taught to Ali by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But intentionally, all of this becomes muddled, and it becomes like, oh, hey, this is a cult. And those who took over afterwards, again, they have lost that message. Also, Noble Drew Ali, what he considered himself to be is one of the descendants of, part of our prayer has to be personal prayer to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to connect to this mission of establishing justice. Part of Noble Drew Ali's kind of mission or his calling was that, hey, my calling is based on, he says, his lineage as well. And so he claimed that he was one of the descendants of another Muslim by the name of Bilal Muhammad, or according to some of the documentations, bin Ali Muhammad. So the son of Ali Muhammad. And so bin Ali Muhammad, he was a Muslim who had been enslaved, but he was also a scholar. So bin Ali Muhammad, or Bilal Muhammad, mostly you'll look up his name, you'll find it by Bilal Muhammad. Although he was enslaved, he was one of those slaves who eventually ended up on the Gullah Islands. And he actually understood that, okay, although I'm enslaved, I have a purpose in life. There's something I have to do. And what was that? He needed to, or at least what we understand from his life and his biography, that he stayed among the slaves to continue to teach them Islam, to be an example of Islam, because he was actually one of those slaves that was allowed to pray and fast. And according to the historical documentation, they said that how many times he prayed a day? 3. So obviously he was joining his prayers. And he also had, they said that in his description, he had a tasbih. So he was either making his tasbih. Also what Bilal Muhammad did when the British came to attack America. So again, one of the things you have to realize is that he's not considered American. He's simply considered Muslim. Because he didn't have this privilege of being that, oh, I'm an American. No. He was considered a slave, not an American, even according to the standards of racism, not even a human being. But none of that mattered to him. Why? Because he considered himself, I'm Muslim. When the British attacked America in the Independence War, Bilal Muhammad was one of those individuals who noted, he says, look, the British are coming, but we don't want to fall into their hands either. So he actually fought in that war of independence against the British. He rallied the other slaves who were Muslim to fight against the British. But of course, this is one of the things they were not teaching in history when I was in school. It's something that I actually went and I began to discover as part of my journey to Islam. So. And one of the reasons I put there that communal prayer, because how do we navigate racial injustice? Not only do we have to make our own prayers for ourselves, as Latifah pointed out, but we also have to make prayers for our next generation, that they find their way, that they are also on that path of justice. So 1990, also part of my journey as well, I come to learn about this individual as well, Umar ibn Sa'id, who was another Muslim, that he found, again, his mission in life. And this is one of the things that we have to understand as well, because he was also a person who was enslaved. He was actually a Quran teacher. He was a scholar in West Africa before he was enslaved. And when he was brought here, he was also, someone who learned to read and write, at least the English, because he already knew how to read and write Arabic. He was proficient. Actually, one of the autobiographies that had been written by slaves was written by him, and he wrote it in Arabic. It still exists. He wrote out different surahs in the Quran in Arabic. When he was also asked to translate the Bible into Arabic, he refused. He refused. He was like, no. Why? Because he understood what it would be used for. If you translate the Bible into Arabic, if he did, then they're going to use this as a tool of trying to convert Muslims, West Africa, to Christian. So that was his mission in life. And one of the interesting points about him as well, when because he was also someone who became trusted by his slave owner, so he would go to the docks to bring in the goods for his slave owner. So in one of his encounters with a kind of an admiral of a ship or a captain of a ship who was a Chinese Muslim, when he met Umar ibn Sa'id, he realized that Umar ibn Sa'id was a scholar. He offered to purchase Umar ibn Sa'id just to free him. He says, can I free you? And so Umar ibn Sa'id, he refused. He says, no. He says, I have to stay. Why do I have to stay? This was his mission in life. He says, because I need to make sure that those who come after me don't forget their religion, don't forget Islam, don't forget where they came from. And this is why, this next slide I'll show you. In 1864 is when Umar ibn Sa'id, he passed away, he died. But before he did so, this was one of the holding cells that he was in. It is it's the Market House, and this is in Fayetteville, North Carolina, probably about an hour and a half up from where I grew up. In this Market House where he was held to be sold at one point, he actually engraved in the walls of this holding cell Ayatul Kursi, and the Lord's Prayer. Lord's Prayer is a very famous prayer within the Bible. So he engraved the Lord's Prayer. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So he engraves this in Arabic, meaning he translates that very famous, prayer on the wall. And immediately beside it, he writes Ayatul Kursi. And then he writes below it a note. He says, look, when we have this, meaning Ayatul Kursi, why do we need that? And it was a message for all the Muslims who came through that holding cell that, look, hold on to your faith. Hold on to your iman. And this is also why he refused that, look, I have an opportunity to save myself. This captain of this ship, he knows I'm a scholar, he will purchase me. He says, but if I go, what's going to happen to all those other individuals who are not scholars, who are enslaved? Who, many of them, just to hold on to their faith, their iman, they are being beaten. They're being, whipped. Some of them even being killed in order to, root out Islam from their identity. And so, as I said, ever since like the 11th century, the West Africa was Muslim, or part of the Muslim lands. And according to one of the famous scholars who taught in American universities, he himself is from East Africa, excuse me, Ali Mazrui. He said about 80% of the slaves that were brought from West Africa were Muslim. About 80%. And of course, among them as well, if we read some of the slave narratives, especially those that are documented in Arabic itself, letters between the slaves, and this is something that, I haven't seen these documents, but in one of the books I've read it, and Muslims, or Servants of God, Enslaved in America, written by Sylvia Leo, who she was actually the librarian for the slave narratives in Washington, who I spoke with her at one of the conferences, because she enters in that book, she has a segment in the book about the Shurafa. And who are the Shurafa? The Shurafa are descendants of a prophet from West Africa. So as in most of the Eastern Islamic lands, we say that the Sayyids are descendants of the prophets. So within West Africa, they used the title Sharif. And so I asked her, I said, okay, well, she entered a number of documentations about the Shurafa in her book. So I asked her, I said, was there more than what you've documented? She said, yes, there are several Shurafa who were enslaved in West Africa and brought here. But their lineage, again, cut off. Their lineage muddled, that like who is Sharif, who is not, who's a descendant of the prophet, who is not. So although they went through that harsh trial of slavery, many of them tried their best to maintain their identity. And a part of that identity and maintaining that identity, that prayer that I would say that some of those who went through the slavery, some of those Muslims who tried to hold on their identity for slavery, making dua for their generations to come. And then we see that Islam, throughout all of the difficulties, not simply discrimination against those who are individuals of colors, but discrimination against Islam itself. Discrimination against Islam itself. That no one wants to see Islam flourish. Even we can say now that when we look at, and this is very, very interesting, because this is one of the things that we have to reflect, that throughout all of this, the difficulties of slavery, of being whipped, of some people being killed just simply because they're la ilaha illallah. They want to pray, they want to fast. But what happens to us today? 9/11 comes and it's like, oh no, I'm not going to pray in public. Why? We have this sense of fear. But when we want to truly navigate racial injustice, we have to look back and see, well, what did all those individuals do? Those individuals, because some people are going to say, oh, you know what, I'm tired of this, I'm going to go back home. I'm going to travel back overseas. But those who stayed and maintained, they says, no, we have to make sure that that next generation, generations beyond our generation, maintains their identity as Muslims. Maintain the sense of justice until it reaches to someone like Malcolm X. And one of the reasons why he uses X, because it's like, well, we don't know our lineage. We don't know our lineage. But nonetheless, we are Muslim, and Hajj Malik Shabazz, and he fought and he stood up for justice. And he fortified not only his individual identity, but the identity of a community as well. So from here onward, what do we have to think? So we need to, again, follow that motto of Islam, of establishing justice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And part of that focus needs to be on these 5 things. And what are those 5 things? One is to understand our mission as Muslims, to And that mission is to bring about justice and equality in this world. Master that mission of faith and justice, because that is an essential part of Islam, the teachings of Islam. And we need to be motivated to do what is right. I'm just trying to go through this quickly so we're not taking up too much time. And understand this movement. And what is that movement? That movement is the movement of Imam Mahdi Ajal Faraj Sharif. To be that symbol of justice, be that symbol of equality based on Islamic standards, and not lose momentum in our mission in life, in our faith, and in our deen. So I'll leave it at this, and I'll close it. I don't know if we probably don't have any time. 2 minutes. So I'll just leave a few minutes if there's anyone who has any questions or maybe any points that they want to make. And I kind of rushed through this presentation a bit, given the time. So. Any? Yeah. Yeah.
And I would have never imagined that what the roots of Kuwaiti was, how it was distorted afterwards, purposely.
Yeah.
And that it was like really, because I met, the community and things like that.
Yes.
And what can happen to a community.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the reason, how I learned about this was a brother, Rahmatullah Ali, who was actually, he's an older brother, unfortunately when he passed away, that he was actually affiliated with the Moorish Science Temple. But he, and this is very early, I guess he was like really young when he had joined, and it was still much closer to the original teachings of Noble Drew Ali. And then he actually saw when things began to change. And when things began to change, he kind of stepped back a bit. And then not too long after that, he had actually become Shia. So he saw the Nation of Islam and all these type of things. So as a matter of fact, Elijah Muhammad was a student of Noble Drew Ali, which a lot of people don't know. They don't realize the history. But yeah, so Elijah Muhammad was a student of Noble Drew Ali. So, once things start to kind of go awry with the Moorish Science Temple, he still considered himself like to be Muslim, but he kind of stepped back and was like, okay, well, what's going on? And the nation is starting up, and then he came across some Shias. And so he was like, oh, well, this aligns with that original teaching that, look, the Shias are those who are connected to Imam Ali. And Imam Ali is teaching Islam based on what was taught by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in fact, he actually gave me documentations to show that how the Moorish Science Temple was actually established. And it says that Noble Drew Ali says that I came to bring Islam or to teach Islam according to the teachings of Ali as it was taught by the Prophet, to him by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Tradition in Latin America of Moors,
Yeah.
and their city's name, Matamoros, like kill the Moors.
Yeah.
That's the name of the city. So it's a kind of same kind of concept.
Yeah. I think I saw a hand on this side. Okay. Wa alaikum salam.
Can you share with us what communities that you may be aware of that are maybe implementing some of your 5 M's that you're speaking of that are already kind of like doing something so that maybe we can kind of learn from them or join with them in their efforts? Or is this something that hasn't started yet?
I don't think it's started yet, and so this is something we have to we have to start. I think that unfortunately sometimes we become complacent in our Islam. We think, oh, hey, yes, good. I've read the Quran, mashallah, finished the Quran, and I'm going to start back over. But how have I actually put this into practice? Have we actually really understood our mission in life here? As Sayyid Sulaiman, he stated, he says, look, Allah hasn't put you in a particular place for just any reason. So have we actually understood that reason? And what is my role in order to, either, tell others about Islam, be an example for others, just like Umar ibn Said, he could have gone free, but he was like, no, I have to stay, because I'm concerned about the Islam and identity of those who may come behind me. They may not know, they may forget. So, yeah.
One of the concerns that I have is that I think to be a flavor of the American society, and I think it's by design, is that we divide, we ourselves divide, okay? We're not united as a people, as a Hispanic community, which they would come from African American or Mexican. And I keep hearing, I'm not my brother's keeper, right? And even though we're Muslim, I think we as a common community still have those things within ourselves. Because what I notice is that when we try to unite, like let's see how we strengthen ourselves from within as a convert community, right? Muslim convert community. It's like we don't trust each other. I don't know if it's just maybe my perception. And it's like we're waiting for someone to rescue us. But shouldn't we try to rescue ourselves first?
Of course, we have to rescue ourselves first. And Allah says this. He says, "Ku anfusakum wa ahlikum." No, save yourself. Yeah, like when you get in a plane, they say that, oh, well, if the plane is going down, the oxygen masks come down. What do you have to do? It says, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then put it on. Why? Because if you try to do this, you may not make it. But if you, boom, I can breathe. Now I can help someone else. So definitely the approach is that, yes, we have to, again, solidify our own identity and mission in life as Muslims, and then reach out to others and help bring them along. And every community has its difficulties. Every community and every person has their challenge. And again, the solution to that, as Sayyid Sulaiman pointed out, as Latifa pointed out, is first and foremost, is to be Muslim. Understand that, okay, yes, this person's Arab, this person's Iranian, this person's, they see whatever they are, mashallah, appreciate, or Latin American, African American, appreciate them for who they are, what they have to offer. But beyond that, and before we actually, and this is not to downplay, that ethnic group that we've been associated with, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed us in. It's not to downplay that at all, but our strongest identity has to be Islam. And when our strongest identity is Islam, then what happens at that point? We look at a person and like, oh, this is my Muslim brother, this is my Muslim sister. Okay, oh, they happen to be from that place? Great. You grew up there? Fine. Tell me about that place. What, what do you have from your background that's useful for me? And what do I have that's useful for you? In order to strengthen not only our Islam, but our bond together. To give you one example, and this is a really interesting example, and that's why I played the Professor Griffin in the beginning, because why a lot of Muslims, especially if they have migrated here, they're like, oh, rap and music. They're going, no, that's a no-no. But myself, I'm like, wait a minute, the first place, before I even became Muslim, before I even started looking into Islam, I heard Professor Griff. I heard Eric B. and Rakim, some of the lyrics are like stuck in my head, but the good one, they were all good because it was about Islam. So for example, Eric B. Rakim, and I didn't know what it meant until I became Muslim. So they had this rap song where they were saying, knowledge me Ahmed. Knowledge me Ahmed. Like, Ahmed, give me knowledge. And so I was just like, I was like rocking to back in the day, but then when I became Muslim, I was like, oh, Ahmed is the name of the prophet. And so they're actually saying, give me knowledge. So they're putting that message out there, but this is also why, again, some of you guys are gonna know how old I am. So this is why, like in the 80s, so many people were coming to Islam. They were gravitating towards Islam in America. Why? Because they were hearing this, and maybe it sparked their curiosity. Eric Rakim again, they were like, look, fish is my favorite dish. I don't touch no swine. I don't, and I don't drink wine. So you're putting all of these like messages, and you're like, oh, what? Hey, what's going on there? And people were coming to Islam. Poor righteous teachers. Again, every single lyric they made was about Islam. Was about Islam. And so, and that was why there was I think a very intentional shift in the music in the 80s, from the 80s going into the 90s. And once the 90s came about, all the lyrics began to be about just filthy stuff, completely filthy stuff. But prior to that, it was all about conscious music, about Islam, about justice, about the injustice that's going on in the society, and you have to stand against that injustice. So yeah. Okay, yeah, we have to wrap it up. So. All right, salawat.
Another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Thank everyone so much for coming. We wish this could be longer and we could ask more questions, but unfortunately we're on a pretty tight time schedule. So if everyone could just be as helpful as possible in cleaning up, that means stacking chairs, cleaning up any food that's in the back, that'll be much appreciated. And again, thank you all for coming. Inshallah, we can end this program out with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.